Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today we're going to discuss a topic that has been coming up discussing with a variety of different clients and prospects, which is about communicating with banks, the reality of, what it's like to deal with banks today, and some kind of tips in terms of how to do that better. If you want to get accounts opened, if you want to keep accounts opened. Okay, so we're going to dive into that today. Now, the basic concept that, well, let me give some context here. I've had some people reach out to me over a while, and they have this basic idea where they'll say, I want a bank that doesn't give me any hassles, doesn't ask any documentation of me, just lets me do my transactions no matter what. This will never happen. Like, never, ever happen, okay? So I think a basic mental model in life, to me, is you should seek to understand the way things are, and then based on the way things are, you should try and architect them to get to the goal that you want to achieve. And the way that things are when it comes to banking is that governments have made banks liable for the actions of their clients. And because of this, banks are hyper concerned about risk. For them, you sending a transfer that turns out to be something negative has this negative blowback potential for them that they're just not willing to take on. They could lose their license. They could have their correspondent banking relationships taken away. They could be fined, et cetera, et cetera. It's just not worth it. So banks are going to ask you for documentation. Banks are going to be a certain way, okay? Another example of this is somebody might say, I had a client mention this recently, hey, these banks don't take time to understand me. They're, either too stupid, too lazy, whatever. It's like, yes, that is going to be the reality. The people at the banks will not understand your business in many, many situations. The kind of garbage that gets put out, I was reading a document somebody had sent me the other day. It was a government document in Latvia giving guidelines for how to decide whether to do business with somebody, whether that person might be a scam or whatever. And it was just such nonsense. Like, the idea that you would ask a government, first of all, to give you advice about how to do business well and how to choose business partners well is a ridiculous notion. Just ridiculous notion. Like, what the hell do they know about this, right? Who is writing this stuff? But on top of that, the things that they were putting down were just so distorted to reality. They were it was like old school superstition, the type of thing I would expect to get from some village where they had superstitions about, oh my gosh, heaven forbid if somebody is this way, right? This is the environment that you're dealing with, and you need to know that going in. So we're going to talk about some specifics of how banks think and how to communicate to how banks think and to that reality. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, hit the all notifications. I really appreciate your subscription. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you don't, please tell me why. If you'd like help with international tax optimization, asset protection, forming companies, opening bank accounts, getting residencies, citizenships, where you could relocate, how to set up your company internationally, please book a call with me. You can do so at calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Or send a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net or offshorecapitalist.com. All right, continuing on. So here's the thing. You just need to understand that banks are going to be lazy. Banks won't understand your business. Banks are going to ask for probably information that you find intrusive, etc. If you think you're going into it saying, oh boy, they don't seem to want my business, yeah, that's going to be the reality. And this is true around the world. I've had some people make comments recently where they say stuff like, oh, this bank can shut your account down for no reason. Beware. It's like, look, this can happen everywhere. Everywhere, from Canada to the US to Australia to Singapore to Switzerland to Dubai to Belize to Bulgaria, you can have your bank accounts shut down with no warning for no reason. That's what can happen, okay? That is the reality of banking today. Banks impede business, they do not facilitate business today. So one of the reasons why when I sometimes make videos on cryptocurrency, etc., I'm quite bullish on it because it's a disaster. Like, the banking world has gone mad. It's terrible, very, very terrible. This being said, what do you do about that? You want to sit and complain about it? You want to cry? I mean, that's just like a terrible way of living. So we want to figure out, okay, let's understand them. Let's figure out how to communicate. And the thing that you want to understand is that banks need to understand things very simply, and they need to understand that it's low risk, that it's legitimate. And the way that you tell them it's legitimate is not by telling them it's legitimate. Coming out and saying, hey, everything I'm doing is legit. That's not going to cut it. That does not pass the standards that are required by banks. So what are some just reasonable expectations for what a bank would have? Well, first of all, you would have a basic understanding, there would be some documentation for transactions. And these transactions would be relatively simple. One of the things that tends to come up is people will use overly vague terminology, and there's this really fine balance in terms of how you communicate with a bank, okay? So, for example, if I say something like payment for services, banks dislike that. Why? Because that could be anything. If I say payments for consulting, that could be anything. Banks dislike it, right? If, on the other hand, I can communicate to you that we sold this product to, we bought this product from here, we sold it to this customer, great. That's a nice, easy transaction that they can understand. Then they can just say, hey, listen, is this product something that we're okay with? Is this, then we're good, right? So you want to be able to communicate in that way, with that kind of clarity, okay? Very, very simple. Now, of course, you want to understand their rules, because sometimes they have problems with something that you would think, why is this a problem? And it shouldn't be a problem. In all honesty, it is ridiculous. Some of the things, there's lots of things people do that it's perfectly legal, it's not hurting anybody, it's fully consensual, whatever, but they consider it high risk and boom, you're shut down. That's a problem, right? So learning to frame what it is that you do in such a way that banks are going to be okay with it is helpful. For example, let's say that you sell assets within video games, right? This could get construed that, oh, you're selling digital currencies. Selling digital currencies for banks is bad, right? Because to them, whoa, you're going to if you think about kind of the idea of what is digital currency, I'm transacting, maybe there's money laundering going on here, etc. Versus if you say, hey, we're a video games marketplace, right? We, go and sell video games, we sell items in video games, this sort of thing. Now it seems more tangible. And if you can give them something that they can relate to, which is very similar, then that's also helpful. And what I mean by something that you can relate to, something low risk, right? Hey, there's this big game, Fortnite, they sell these items, we're like them, right? We're basically like them in this other game. Okay, perfect. We can understand this. This kind of thing is very useful. Then being able to show that you have the pieces in place that support that with invoices, documentation. Like the idea for a bank is that, listen, if you're doing a transaction, of course, you're going to have a contract. Of course, you're going to have an invoice. Of course, you're going to have these types of things, right? So I can communicate very, very simply what's going on. So if what you're trying to communicate, if you think, hey, I'm having to communicate this and it's communicated in a way that's difficult to understand, and I mean obtusely so simple. Here's an example. I sat with a very senior banker one time and was explaining to them about Facebook advertising. I'm like, hey, you see these ads on Facebook? Somebody has to pay for those. They're like, really? They do? Like, you would think this is really obvious. Apparently not so much to bankers. A little bit like Mark Zuckerberg, you might have seen in the Senate Joint Subcommittee or whatever it was, review, and they asked, hey, Facebook is free. How is it that you guys make money? And they're like, the famous line from Mark Zuckerberg, Senator, we run ads. That kind of thing. You need to be able to communicate to somebody who probably doesn't understand. You have to understand that when you're communicating with, again, setting some context here, so they're very risk averse. When you're communicating, you're not communicating usually to the person who you're going to deal with. You're probably communicating to a low-level peon who is then communicating to somebody else who's a fairly low-level peon. What do I mean by this? You're probably dealing with like a customer service person who has no business experience, no business understanding, etc. They're not even a sophisticated banker, right? That's the reality. Then they're probably communicating to a compliance person, and the compliance person has no business experience. Okay? Just think about that. You have likely somebody who is pretty old school running compliance. They probably don't have business experience. They have been trained to be hyper vigilant and to go down a checklist aggressively to exclude things. Their job is to be a gatekeeper, not somebody who's opening doors for you. That's the reality. So you can kind of think about it a little bit like there's a set of locks and you need to provide these things in order to open the lock. Okay, so what do you need to be able to provide? You need to be able to provide a basic understanding in super simple terms, ideally point A to point B. Probably more than that is too complicated. Transactions, right? Because that's what's happening. Money's moving from here to here. Who are those participants? Why is that happening? And back it up with documentation, okay? So if you can do that, you're going to be better off, okay? Then you want to realize, just think about it this way. If you are a banker and you're hyper risk averse, what does that mean to you to be risk averse? Like, what are all the possible things that they might have a problem with? Make sure you communicate around those, right? There are ways to adjust this in such a way that they can understand it as not being risky. And so, hey, is this a risky industry? Show them it's not a risky industry. Hey, is this possibly money laundering? Show them that it's not money laundering. It's a perfectly legitimate transaction. Hey, is this some sort of proceeds of crime? You can show it's not proceeds of crime. So the money came from here, I took the money, I sent it to here for this thing, which happens to be perfectly legitimate. I hope that helps, okay? I hope that gives you a basic idea. If you have questions, dealing with banks is a pain in the ass. It just is. This being said, the reality today, unfortunately, is we have to deal with banks. So if you'd like help with that, please reach out to me. Put some comments below. If you have suggestions that you've come across that have worked really well, put them in the comments below as well. Of course, some banks are easier to deal with than others, and that's wonderful. But just increasingly, this is the reality, and you're going to have to deal with it. So I hope it helps. Reach out to us if you need help, and I'm going to see you guys on the next video.